Hey, everybody, and welcome to Mega Shift today. Today on Mega Shift, we are talking about one of the biggest shifts happening in technology right now, and that is what happens when platforms stop owning their users and the internet starts to look more like shared infrastructure. So, our guest today is Jim Ray. He works in developer relations over at Blue Sky Social. How are you doing today, Jim?
I'm fantastic, Rob. I really love that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And yeah, a little bit about our guest, Jim. Thanks for being here. You spent your career at the intersection of storytelling, engineering, and developer ecosystems. You started in media, building out multimedia storytelling tools at well-known media companies like MSNBC and Chicago Tribune. Before moving more into the product and publishing system side of it, you spent nearly a decade at Slack, where you were scaling one of the most important developer ecosystems in SaaS. And now you're over at Blue Sky Social, working on something that's fundamentally different here, and that's helping developers build on an open protocol that is designed to reshape how social networks even function, how they work from the ground up. So for listeners, if you all care about the future of social media, developer platforms, and who actually owns this relationship with users and the infrastructure that supports social media, then this episode is for you. So, welcome to Mega Shift, Jim.
Amazing, Rob. I love that introduction. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, why don't we start, at the top? So, what are you working on at Blue Sky right now? And could you kind of, for those boomers out there, or folks who aren't familiar with Blue Sky, could you share a little bit about what Blue Sky is?
Fantastic. Yeah. There's a common joke on Blue Sky that it's the website for 38-year-olds. And so I'm a little bit, I help kind of bring the youngins along to that average, but it's definitely kind of the social media app that a lot of folks settled on when social media started getting really corrosive over the past few years. But I'll try to answer all of those questions. So first and foremost, what are we working on right now? So we're recording about a week before the second ever Atmosphere Conf. And Atmosphere Conf is a community-led conference for everyone who's developing on the AT protocol. And we'll talk about the protocol, I'm sure, plenty, but the protocol is kind of what underlies Blue Sky, the social network. One thing I love about this conference, this is my first time going. I've been at Blue Sky for about 5 months now. The last one was held about this time last year. But one thing I love about the conference is that we, Blue Sky, the company, are not organizing it. It's actually organized by the community itself, which is a little bit different coming from the world of enterprise software, where Salesforce spends mega money to organize their developer conferences and user conferences every year. So that's what we're working on right now. Is we're really excited about getting out there. I'm super excited to get out and meet a lot of folks that I only know online. We'll be up in Vancouver, but I think by the time this recording goes, the conference will have just happened. So kind of after the conference, we're looking at continuing to evolve the protocol. And the protocol is technically not yet at a 1.0. We've still got a couple of features that we want to put into place. A big one that we're working on right now is one that we call permission data. And permission data is really just it's kind of what it says on the tin, how do you actually create structures for your data that we save to the network in such a way that it's not completely open and public, and that you can create something like user groups is maybe the best example for it. So if you just had a small group of people that wanted to discuss a particular topic, if you organize around regions. So that's one example of what we're thinking with permission data. Another is if you wanted to build something like a gated website that only people who paid or subscribed, then you would want to make sure that all of that data is not available. And I realize I've completely jumped into the middle of things, so we can back up a little bit and talk about the protocol too, if that would be interesting.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's awesome. You guys have the conference planning underway, and that's coming up. Yeah, like zooming out. So social media is a really large, broad topic. There's these new entrants that like Blue Sky, which gained a lot of popularity. There's just this idea of kind of the federated internet, the Fediverse. Maybe could you talk a little bit about what Blue Sky does, or the concept of federation that maybe is part of the ethos of what Blue Sky does?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that in some ways, this idea of decentralization and federation feels really new, but it's also very old in a lot of ways too. Like when you go back and think about what they were originally thinking about the internet back in the 60s and the 70s, the idea was the internet was supposed to be decentralized from the beginning. That was the entire ethos of ARPANET, was that we didn't want to have one centralized place. This is during Cold War era that could be nuked by the Russians. And so we like the idea of having a network that could exist on multiple nodes was kind of revolutionary at the time, and really the foundation of the internet. And I think this is a story that a lot of people know, is that the internet arrives to mass appeal at some point in the 90s. And then in the early to mid 2000s, the social era of the internet, Web 2, user generated content, however we kind of want to think about the emergence of that, shows up. And then it starts to consolidate around these platforms. And, you know, I think we all have lots of opinions about how and why that happened. I think the incentives were just there for these platforms to really capture what has turned into multiples of billions of people. And we're starting to see now that there's knock-on effects of that are not great. And so the idea of what we're trying to do with the protocol is really kind of a reversion to what some of the early idealism of the internet was, but also recognizing that some of the structure that was put into place with some of those early idealistic wasn't necessarily going to scale to millions and billions of people. And so recognizing how the world has changed and shifted and things like that. So that's kind of broadly what we talk about when we talk about decentralization and federation. And so there's a few different approaches that folks are taking to this. I think the most prominent ones that your listeners might be familiar with are ActivityPub, which is what Mastodon is based on, and then At Protocol, which is what Blue Sky is based on. And I don't necessarily see them as competing. I think there's lots of areas that we can work together, and we are working together on things like decentralized identity, addressable content, and then the parts where we kind of diverge are, I think, good. There are technologies that will bridge the two networks if that's something that you're interested in. But I think it's probably okay to have some philosophical differences about how you want to do decentralization and federation. And so, but one thing that we do at Blue Sky that's maybe a little bit different, and again, this is one of those things that you might not have predicted in the 70s or the 90s or even 15 years ago if you were thinking about, like, I want to create a federated decentralized social network. And so one of the things that Blue Sky does is, one, it's decentralized in the sense that the infrastructure, anybody can kind of manage various parts of the infrastructure. So if you think about like a centralized web service, then you think that there's like a database that backs it up. There's kind of the middleware that handles all of the business logic. There is the web browser display or the mobile display. And on Blue Sky, you can kind of own whichever part of that you want to. And so we have a piece called a personal data server. And so if you want to run your own personal data server on your computer at home, or if you want to sign up for there are some services. There's one called Black Sky. There's one called Euro Sky. There's another one called North Sky. So these are kind of more community oriented, and they're offering up some of the infrastructure pieces. And so I think that's one of the things that At Protocol does that's pretty unique, is we kind of break that monolith apart into different pieces and let people pick and choose. And it's not just the technological pieces, but also if you want to choose a different moderation stack, then you can build on our base layer of moderation and then kind of layer on your own moderation. If you want to create your own feed so that you're not just using our reverse chronological feed or our discover feed, then people are creating their own feeds as well. And so that part kind of excites me a lot, and what really got me motivated to learn more about App Protocol. And now it's what I work on every day.
Nice, nice. Yeah, that's awesome. And so focusing on the different components that Blue Sky offers, that underlying infrastructure. So if somebody wants to build an application on the protocol, that's definitely an option. And with you being in developer relations, you're thinking a lot about how folks are building on Blue Sky and what utility it provides developers. Just quickly on the flip side, like why is decentralization maybe good for end users or neutral for end users, but like what I guess what is the promise of that decentralization for users? And then we'll get into a bit more of what your day to day looks like, actually working with developers.
Yeah, of course. I don't necessarily think that a lot of people wake up thinking like, boy, I really got to get onto a decentralized social media platform. In much the same way that 20 years ago, nobody woke up and said, I got to get on social media. And so there is a little bit of helping people understand what are some of the advantages of the decentralized aspect. And I've been in this career for long enough that I'm pretty confident that trying to sell people on the idea of the pure technological solution is just, it really never works out. And so you kind of have to think about what the user experience is. And so that's kind of how the team that built the protocol initially really thought about it is they never set out to build like a competing social network. There were a lot of things that happened between the time that the work on the protocol started and Blue Sky with 43 million people exists today. And really, the idea was let's build a decentralized protocol. And then Blue Sky was the application on top of it to demonstrate what's possible with the protocol. And a lot of what I am interested in doing and trying to do is bring in as many developers as possible, give them some of the advantages, give them the tools to build these applications, and then build those experiences that are going to be the kinds of things that users really want and need. And at the same time, I do think that we can help users understand why these features are an advantage. So nobody, I would say nobody wakes up and says like, oh, I got to get on a decentralized social media platform. But people do wake up and realize that the social media platform where they have all their friends, where their livelihood or their jobs or their hobbies might be, all of a sudden it's no longer good anymore, or it's like become toxic in ways that they don't really love. And they don't necessarily have any options. They can't take all of their Twitter followers to another social network, or they can't take the business that they've built and relies in part on YouTube or Instagram or something like that. And so then they kind of feel a little bit stuck. And so then I do think people start to understand like, oh, there are some advantages to things like account portability, to being able to choose my own moderation stack. And so, people don't necessarily have to be like philosophically aligned with this idea of decentralization to understand like, oh, this isn't actually good, or this isn't actually what I want. And maybe I want something a little bit different. And so we're seeing a fair bit of that from some of the community projects that have emerged, but also just from kind of the user base broadly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like it's kind of a build it and they will come opportunity in that people might not yet know their preferences, but maybe they're like, well, I don't want to see all my memories from 2008 when I was in high school yeah, or whatever, posting every single night, every single sleepover, college, parties, things like that. And yeah, maybe like having just preferences. Folks might not even know what they are yet, and it creates that kind of opportunity for that. And then that the developers to build bespoke solutions like based on their ideas. Well, that's fascinating. And so you're building this new infrastructure, the protocol, and there's been a lot of time invested in building that out. So as you mentioned, day to day engaging developers, thinking about use cases, understanding what types of things people want to build. Just zooming out as a developer relations professional, you did a lot of this type of work over at Slack. Like, what does your day to day look like at Blue Sky and kind of the developer ecosystem you guys are kind of thinking about it? How are you thinking about it?
It's a great question. And there are a lot of similarities among developer relations roles. And then there are so many differences. Every community is different in some unique ways. And there's a big difference between the enterprise software developer and the kinds of folks that are building on Blue Sky, especially at this stage. And so One of the kind of key differences is that folks who are building Slack applications are oftentimes doing it as part of their paid job. It's they might own a part of that stack. I'm going to move back into Slack mode here for a little bit, but the average Fortune 500 company subscribes to something like 1,000 SaaS services, which is absolutely insane to me. I've said that probably 10,000 times in my life, and it still like just blows my mind. Um, and so there are groups of people whose job it is to maintain those, and that includes software like Slack. And we were very lucky that we kind of hit that sweet spot of like an application that felt like a consumer app, especially in the like mid 2010s. The APIs were much nicer to work with, a lot more ergonomic, a lot more developer friendly. And so it was something that people really enjoyed working on, as opposed to the average, SaaS software stack where you have to use a specific tool chain, or you're not loving the kinds of results that you're getting back, a lot of like Java and XML and things like that. And so that's kind of like one of the key differences, is just like a day job thing versus a kind of more of a passion project. And so the existing app protocol community right now, there are a lot of people that are just very personally invested in these things, in the way that folks were kind of in the early days of Slack before we pivoted into the enterprise space. And so that part is actually really, really exciting. I really love seeing the passion that kind of comes out of the ecosystem. It does mean that projects launch like on a Saturday night, so it's a little bit different. So I'm tuning in kind of at different times than maybe I was, but I really, really love that passion quite a bit. And so, but at the end of the day, I think developers still have similar problems across whether or not they're doing it as their day job, or they're doing it in their free time, or trying to build a business on it, or whatever it might be. They need great documentation. They need good tooling. They need connections to other people. They need help figuring out sustainability. And that was true at various points in, one of the reasons that I stuck around at Slack for so long, besides the fact that it was just filled with the most amazing people I've ever worked with in my career, is that the time that I was there from 2016 until 2026 was 2025. Yeah, there we go. It was 4 or 5 different companies in that time. Like when I joined, it was a high growth kind of classic venture funded startup, pivoting into enterprise space, then becoming a public company. And then the pandemic really just kind of, just like it did across the entire industry, shook things up, and then we got acquired. And so just like new things to learn at every one of those stages. And now that I'm back at a much smaller place, and I can see that same kind of growth trajectory too. And so getting to reapproach different problems, but from a slightly different way. Hopefully we get to make new, better mistakes this time than I did the last time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting you bring up all those different similarities and how, developers are still developing, and they need the ability to solve like highly technical problems, and sometimes, nitty-gritty client server stuff. Like it could be anything. And so what are some of those kind of key developer, I don't want to call them pain points, because they might not be pains, but this is an evolving space. So like what are some of the common things going on in this domain right now that the developers
Yeah.
are thinking about, that you're thinking about, and then, of course, creating docs to problem solve against those challenges. But what are some of the
Yeah.
big, like maybe the big three, or, however you guys like to think about it?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I will say the first problem is really just helping developers understand what is different about a decentralized protocol versus making API calls to a centralized platform. So that's like problem number one. And your framing I really liked. I try to frame things in terms of challenges instead of problems. So it is a real challenge, and it was like the first big challenge for me, honestly, when I first started looking at app protocol. I was just like, how, like, where's the blue sky endpoint? How do I make the call to this? But again, because blue sky is built on top of the protocol, we still have to obey all of the rules of the decentralized protocol. And so blue sky itself, there are API endpoints that we call them XRPC. But the idea is that everything that exists on the network exists on top of the AT protocol. So when you build an application like Blue Sky on top of the protocol, then the expectation is that you are going to kind of follow the rules. And so, traditionally, like when you go build a Slack app, for instance, then like you're a customer and or you have a workspace, or maybe you even have a test workspace, and then you go look at our documentation and you say, okay, great, I'm going to make a call to api.slack.com, and it's this endpoint, and then I will be able to, I'll make an OAuth request, I'll get my token back with these scopes, and then I'll use that token to make the subsequent requests. And there's kind of a layer below that you are required to understand when you start working on app protocol, or app protos we call it. And so it's not just like, oh, I'm just going to like get my API token and start immediately making calls to Blue Sky. No, so there's just a couple of fundamental layers that you need to understand. And so, because app protocol is fundamentally decentralized, there's not like a single place that you're calling to. Now, if you do want to, make a post that shows up on Blue Sky, then you're creating lexicons, which is kind of a new concept, that live on an individual user's PDS. You need to make sure that you have the authentication credentials. And again, we use OAuth for that. So there are some similarities, but at the end of the day, what you're doing is a little bit different. You're not making that call to an API that stores some information in like a Postgres database or something like that. You're then like saving information on an individual user's personal data server, and then there is a relay that comes along and pulls all of that information together and then creates what we call the fire hose. And that fire hose is all of the activity that happens on the protocol. And so like helping folks understand that, we have a lot of, as you can imagine, as Blue Sky got more popular, there were a lot of these like social media management apps that were just like, oh, we have to integrate Blue Sky because like the mayor of Boston wants to, switch away from Twitter and on to Blue Sky, right? And we're like, this sounds great. And they're just like, can you just give us our API credentials? And it's like, okay, hold on. We need to take a step back here and kind of understand what's different about this. And, it's like people get it, but it does require a little bit more work for sure up front.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, as you're chatting through that, it's like I guess the relationships, the object model is different. It's like entities are different, the way that things are stored are different. So yeah, I haven't seen a diagram myself yet, but I imagine it's a really interesting paradigm shift. And like some folks may be more familiar with the idea of like Bitcoin and blockchain and DAO. And, we don't need to necessarily get into all of that, but, so like, are there some similarities that you guys use that as an analogy or complementary kind of concepts that make it easier to tell that story? Or is it fundamentally different than even that?
Like, I thought that blockchain was going to be kind of an interesting entryway into helping people understand this. I feel like blockchain actually kind of confuses people a little bit more. And then because the politics of blockchain are what they are, then, sometimes people are just like, oh, I'm not doing anything with blockchains. And so like one important thing to understand is that the foundational data structure is something called a Merkle search tree. And as Paul Frazee, our CTO, likes to understand, is like developers should not need to understand what a Merkle search tree is in order to use our network. But like, if you really want to understand the fundamentals, you need to understand a Merkle search tree. And blockchains use Merkle trees as well. And so, that's kind of the area of overlap. I like to think of Git as maybe a better analog for understanding how the network works, because so AT stands for authenticated transfer. And the idea is that kind of like one of the fundamental ideas that makes the system work is that every piece of content that shows up in what we call the fire hose, the vast majority of which is Blue Sky content, but it doesn't have to be Blue Sky content. It could be blog posts, there's photo sharing sites, there's TikTok clones, things like that. Is that they're all signed. And so in much the same way that every time you make a Git commit, every single one of your Git commit has a hash to it so that you can like uniquely address that Git commit. And so like developers, like in the same way that like, I think it's a pretty common trope, every developer I know has gotten to a state with Git where they've had to just like throw away their like local Git repository and just pull from from the remote again. And so I think in much the same way that like developers understand the advantages of Git and understand like, particularly if you've used other source control systems like Subversion back in the day and things like that, where there was like a centralized server and then you were the client. One of the really interesting things about Git is like that client server paradigm no longer exists. And so like everyone who's using Git is potentially their own server and potentially their own client. And so I think developers kind of grok that and grok the advantages, even if they don't understand like the fundamentals of how it works, like fully underneath. And so I like that's kind of how I am approaching a little bit helping developers understand using the platform is that like if you want to get really into like how Merkle search trees work and how all of the cryptography works, then it's actually a really cool part of it. But it's fundamentally not like necessary if you just want to like build the next cool app on App Proto.
Nice, nice. Yeah, yeah, that sounds so interesting. All my synapses are firing here about hearing about that. And so, looking at this upcoming community conference atmosphere, thinking about the types of story you guys are telling, how you're engaging in the community, and I imagine some of what your GTM team is doing. But what are some things you guys are seeing developers build right now that kind of feels like an indication of where things are going? Social apps can have a lot of different types of social elements, right? Maybe it's for photo sharing, or maybe it's for blogging, right? And maybe it's for sharing what movies you watched recently. So, we've seen that Web 2, Web 3. What are you guys seeing that kind of feels like it's getting some traction now, or that you could share?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I would love it if we had a GTM team. We're still a very small organization,
Okay,
so
okay, yeah, yeah.
we're just over 40 people now, and so GTM is very much kind of like a loose affiliation of people. We have a partnership team on kind of that work on like Blue Sky the app, and I kind of overlap with them a little bit, particularly when we start talking about some of like the technical implementation details. And then we have what we call the atmosphere team, which is like the protocol team, and that's the team that I work on. And so we're all kind of doing GTM like features. So it was just very amusing to hear you say that. But in terms of like the shape of the apps that are emerging, like I really feel like our CTO Paul says that 2026 is going to be the Atmos year. He loves coining a phrase. And so we've all kind of taken that to heart internally. But it really does, like, I would say starting maybe very end of last year, but certainly over the past few months at the start of this year, we've really seen a pretty big explosion in all different kinds of apps. And one of the things I'm particularly excited about, and because I come with like kind of a publishing background, we're trying to coin this phrase like atmospheric websites, and it's basically like adding social features using App Protocol to existing websites. And so we just recently launched about a month ago. We relaunched appproto.com, which is it's the site that we own that is kind of like the starting place for documentation and learning about how to build on App Proto. And my colleague Alex did a ton of work just like knocking all the docs into shape and things like that. And one of the things that we wanted to do, so we migrated the blog content into the new appproto.com site. And one of the things that we wanted to do was take advantage of some of the community projects that have been happening around the protocol. And so there's this lexicon called standard site. And not to get too into it, but lexicons are basically just like the file format of App Proto. So anytime you build an app, in much the same way that like if you build a text editing app, then maybe your file format is Markdown. If you build an image creation app, then your file format is JPEG or something that has layers and things like that to it, right? So if you're going to build a social app, then one thing that one of the primitives of the protocol is something called lexicons. And lexicons are basically just the shape of the data of your app. And if you're a database person, you might think of them as like schemas or something like that. They're defined in JSON. And so your Blue Sky posts, for instance, they have lexicons associated with them. And so that has all of the metadata and then like the actual content of your post, if you've uploaded a photo, all of that kind of good stuff. And then those are what gets saved to your data server. And so there's this lexicon called standard site. If you go to standard.site, then it kind of outlines it. And what it was is a collaboration between some of the blogging platforms that are emerging on the protocol now. And they were like, hey, let's work together on creating, like, let's really dig into the ethos of at protocol here, and we'll work together on creating this shared lexicon. And so now you can go to leaflet.pub, or you can go to pocketpct.blog, and they both use the same lexicon. And so when you save your blog post, whether you're on Pocket or whether you're on Leaflet, there's actually Green Gale is another one that are using these same lexicons, then that kind of open source file is stored on your data server. Our blog is a custom thing that we built using Next.js. And so we just integrated those standard site lexicons into our blog publishing flow. So now when we write a blog, we also publish this standard site lexicon to the @proto.com PDS. And now what happens is it gets picked up. There are these reader applications, kind of similar to something like an RSS reader. And so that are picking up all of these standard site lexicons as well. So you can build like custom views of it. Leaflet has a view where they can show you kind of like what's hot in the ecosystem, like popular publications. You can subscribe to different ones. I'm really interested to see, I'd love to see kind of a convergence of RSS and standard site, because there's obviously a lot of overlap between what RSS does, but also some pretty unique things that standard site allows on the protocol. And so I'm pretty excited to take, RSS is a 30-year-old technology at this point, but still amazing and still really going strong, and like, part of that kind of like plumbing of the internet. Really looking forward to seeing some of that happen, some of those convergences happen. So that's one way that we're like, this atmospheric websites concept is one that I'm super excited about, one that I'm hoping and really actively trying to encourage more publishers to do. Something beyond just the protocol, I'm really excited to see a lot of these community funded publications coming along. Defector is probably one of my favorite examples of these. So really love what they've been doing. They've been going strong for 6 or so years now, I think. And but I'm loving all of these like small reader supported publications, and I think that the protocol can, like, the goals of those publications, again, going back to kind of the original ethos of the internet, the goals of what we want to do on the protocol are very, very well matched. And so I'm pretty optimistic that we can work together and do some cool stuff together.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. Like, I also, as you're sharing that, it's like, okay, maybe it's like the schema.org, like the way that early search and like how Google kind of puts some parameters around like sitemaps and search and XML and all of that, robots.txt. It's like, if we're going to have a federated internet, like, AI and AEO and all these, discoverability is a piece. So it sounds like, in building this out, like that is potentially the path to federated spaces showing up in AI search and having that uniformity, so you kind of get best of both worlds. So that sounds like a really cool domain area. Awesome. And so in that spirit, like, how is the prevalence of AI vibe coding and just the pace of authoring apps and publishing things and getting your docs up there so that Claude can read them? Like, how is all this supercharging the space? And on the flip side of that, like, does that impact the authenticity piece of it? And like, can people just make a decentralized thing, but they can be anonymous? And like, thoughts on that? AI,
oh man,
the big space, but yeah. What are some
have
of
you
the
heard
things
about this
that,
AI thing? And
yes.
yeah. So like, everybody working in technology and I think everybody working outside of technology, I have lots of thoughts and feelings, and probably more feelings than thoughts even, about AI. I'll try to give my most optimistic take about where some of this stuff is going, and then maybe I'll veer into some of the pessimistic takes, since I think it's important to kind of think about what My big thesis about what really went wrong with the internet is that the people who were in charge never stopped to think what would happen if they actually won, and they were only ever in war mode, and then they all won, and they were just like, oh, I guess we've taken over, and we don't really have a plan for what's next. So, but kind of optimistically, like my biggest hope for what a lot of these, particularly like the LLM coding tools will enable. I've got some strong, slightly spicy opinions about things like the image generation tools, which I'm not a huge fan of personally. But the LLM coding tools, I see what people are producing with them. I see like some of the spirit that I really feel from those early days of the internet. And there are a couple of ways I'm thinking about this. One is that like we are right at the cusp, right at the beginning of an era of just personalized and personalizable software. It's always been, I feel like, kind of a goal. And I know that there's like, you go back to RDF, even some of like the early Unix theses. And the idea that software would be not something that would just be kind of like monolithic and contained and require an app store, but was always kind of there. And again, I think we kind of broke some of that over the last 20 years. And so my hopeful take is that AI allows people to write completely personalizable software. Craig Maud, the great writer, blogger, and walker across Japan, really recently had a great piece about this. About he's got this really, because he lives in Japan and he works in media and does a lot of side projects and things like that. It's basically impossible for him to like fit all of that into like traditional accounting software. So he had Claude just like create his own personal accounting system, and he said that it's like the most amazing system that he's ever used. And you hear this from all kinds of folks. We just hired a director of communications here at Blue Sky, and he's not a technical person. He will be the first to admit, he's like, I tried to learn Python 15 years ago and it didn't stick. And over the weekend, he sat down and built out a kind of a version of Goodreads because his wife was so annoyed with the fact that Goodreads hadn't been updated, I think, since Amazon acquired it. And he built that on the protocol. And so those are the kinds of things that I have a ton of optimism about, and the idea that we can actually empower people. Now again, we're going to have to make sure that the tools are there to do the empowering, not to just, it seems like we're heading in a direction where there's going to be like 3 people who are in charge of all the LLMs, and that will not be great. But I'm really interested in what's happening with like the open source LLM space and things like that. And another way that I think about this is like, do you remember the first time you went to a web page and you were like, man, how did they do that? And you went up and you hit view source and you like combed through, and then you had to just like, what does this tag mean? Or what does this JavaScript function do? And then you figured it out and you made your own version of it with a slight tweak. And so this idea that like our computers and our applications now effectively have view source, not in the sense that like we're going through and like decompiling the binaries specifically, but like, we can feed some ideas into an LLM and then it can create something for us, particularly with how powerful web technologies are these days and how easy it is to deploy things pretty much anywhere and everywhere. I have a huge amount of optimism about that. And so I'm really hopeful. And I also really think that like the protocol can be a big part of that. So the idea of being able to own your identity and not have your identity owned by one of these corporations. And then, as we work through this permission data piece, where you can have public information that anybody can see and you can interact with and can become discoverable, but then you can also kind of create your own communities and things like that, and all of that is tied into the same identity space. And then you can create unique experiences around that on the web or on your mobile device, or even just for you and your family. I like that is like the most optimistic kind of solar punk version of this. And then there is, of course, like the dystopian version, and that gets into the part of your question about identity and like authenticity and how do we kind of manage that. And so that's something that we think about quite a bit. We are in the midst of rolling out a feature that will allow people who operate bots on the network. There are some real, like, everybody think bots on social media. It's like, oh, they're like spam bots, or they're like Russian bots that are trying to overthrow democracy or whatever it is. There are actually some really fun bots on the network too. One nice thing about Blue Sky is it's not quite big enough yet for like the GRU folks to come and like try to turn it into a mass. I'm sure there is plenty of that, but a mass surveillance system or something like that. And so there are actually some like fun, kind of artsy, a lot of game kind of things. And so, the first step that we're doing is saying, like, if you build one of these things, then you should be able to declare that this is a bot that's operating on the network. And then people who don't want to see bots, they can filter that out. People who want to discover new bots, they can like, oh yeah, this one is just like telling me what my weather is, or like, there's a fun kind of social game or something like that we can play. So I think that'll be kind of important. Our head of trust and safety is right now, as we're recording this, he's he's in Europe, in Brussels, talking with a bunch of other smart trust and safety folks about kind of what's coming. I was just reading a thread. He was kind of live posting from this workshop that he was at, and when you think about what's coming, the kind of interference that we saw in, around 2016 and even in 2020 from like foreign governments and things like that stuff is coming, but it's targeting the large language models themselves. And so like, if you can poison the LLM with just like enough bots in Reddit threads and things like that, so that's like really worrisome. And that's where, again, not necessarily relying on like three huge mega companies that are all like funded by the same petro state, but like having some open source alternatives. And, we're thinking like, is that the kind of thing that we can help host? Is that the kind of thing that we can help people like host on their own in the same way that we help people like host their own data and things like that? And so that's kind of like, we're trying to avoid the complete dystopian nightmare and really move more towards like the solar punk utopian vision of what that might look like.
Nice, nice. Yeah, that the light and the dark there, and yeah, like thinking about it from a utility perspective, and what makes sense for the builders, what makes sense for the users, and like back to those preferences, and like being how much does one want to participate and in what way do they want to participate, and that's like the new paradigm, right? And to the infrastructure kind of backs that up. And yeah, so this has been a really fascinating conversation. Is there anything else that we haven't had a chance to talk about that you'd like to share or touch on?
Yeah, I'm super excited to just have the opportunity. We've kind of taken this kind of mock slogan a little bit of we can just build things, and I think that is really kind of the core of the community. It's something we say kind of jokingly, but also not to get too sentimental about it, but like it's something that we really do feel pretty deeply, is that like we can internally, it's like we can build tools to enable people to just build things. And the same for the community. It's something I actually really love this ecosystem. I was pretty nervous coming into it because I come from this like enterprise software space. I was like, I don't have like a huge history. I had to kind of learn all of this stuff, bootstrap my own knowledge about it in a lot of ways. Everyone has been so kind and so generous. And so it is a really, really fantastic community. There's never been a better time if you've ever had an idea for like, even if it's just for like your own community or your own neighborhood or something like that, I think there's been this thought that, oh, I guess I'll spin up a Facebook group, and it's like, oh, Facebook. But like, there's never really been a better time to like create your own neighborhood group, and you don't have to rely on Nextdoor or Facebook or, one of these like huge platform things. You can just build something yourself. You can use the tools that App Proto enables and kind of bring people on board to it. I'm super optimistic at what some like local governments are trying to do. We're having some really interesting conversations with them. Like the idea that a city could, you could have an identity system that is App Proto underneath, but nobody needs to know that. You don't need to know that, like, you don't sign in with your Blue Sky account necessarily. You just sign in, like you create an account, you give us your email address or not. And all of a sudden you're able to, report that like there's a pothole and you don't have to like go through some platform to do that. So, but I just can't say enough great things about the ecosystem, about the folks that are in it, how welcoming they are. And it's small and we're growing it. One of my goals for the year is to make the protocol much more approachable to like, I think of it as kind of like more traditional web developers, because we've got a lot of like really hardcore protocol people and some great web developer people. There's a project that just launched earlier this month called npmx, which is for like browsing the npm directory. and so they kind of like layered these social features on top of that. But yeah, I could not say enough great things about how fantastic this community is, how welcome they are, and how privileged I really feel to be a part of it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim. That's awesome, and I love, yeah, I love the optimism. Now is the time. So thank you for joining us on the Mega Shift podcast. Really, has been a pleasure learning more about your work over at Blue Sky. Built on that foundation of over a decade working on developer tools over at Slack. And so, yeah, thank you so much, and we'll catch everybody next time on Mega Shift.
Thanks so much, Rob.
Thank you.